What if you could peek into the mind of God and see his eternal blueprint for, well, for everything? For centuries, some of the sharpest theological minds did just that. They tried to map out the logical order of God's plan for humanity. And today, we're diving straight into that very debate, the Lapsarian question.
But get this, at the very heart of this huge theological puzzle is a pretty spicy historical mystery, an accusation really. The question is, did the man John Calvin himself chose to succeed him, a guy named Theodore Beza, actually betray his mentor's entire system of thought? That's the charge we're going to investigate.
For a long time, this was the story scholars told. The claim was that Beza, looking through what they called Aristotelian spectacles, took Calvin's dynamic, living theology and basically froze it solid into a rigid philosophical system. So, what was he? A faithful student or a corrupter?
All right, so here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we'll look at the accusation itself. Then, we'll figure out what this Lapsarian question is all about. We'll break down the two main views, supra versus infra, glance at some of the other perspectives, and finally, see how the debate played out to get our verdict on Bezalel.
Okay, let's dive right in. Section 1, Calvin versus the Calvinists. We're going to get right to the heart of the accusation that was leveled against Theodore Beza. But hold on, it's not quite that simple. As this quote points out, more recent scholarship has totally flipped the script. It suggests that the real culprit here might not be Beza at all, but the very modern historians who are pointing the finger at him. Now that's the mystery we need to unpack.
On to Section 2, the Lapsarian question. To figure out who's right, we have to understand what they were even arguing about, and it all comes down to this key idea of a decretal order.
So, Lapsarian, it sounds complicated, but it just comes from the Latin word lapsus, which means the fall. The Lapsarian question is all about the logical sequence of God's eternal decisions or his decrees. Think about it like this. In God's mind, which idea came first? The decision to create humanity, knowing we would fall, or the decision to save some of us from that fall?
Okay, and this is absolutely the most important thing to get straight. We are not talking about a timeline. Nobody was arguing that God made one decision on Monday and another on Tuesday. God doesn't operate on our schedule. All of these decrees are eternal, happening all at once. The whole debate is purely about logical priority. Which decision is the foundation for the others in God's grand design?
All right, Section 3. This is where the two heavyweights enter the ring. Two major positions popped up to solve this puzzle, and they became the stars of the show: supralapsarianism and infralapsarianism.
First up, supralapsarianism. Supra means above. This view says that God's decision to save some people, the elect, and pass over others, the reprobate, is logically above or before his decision to even create the world. Imagine an architect who, before drawing a single line for a new city, decides exactly who the most glorious citizens are going to be. Then, he designs the entire city, including its flaws, specifically to make sure that chosen group ends up on top. And this flowchart, man, it lays out that blueprint perfectly. Logically, step 1 is the decree to elect and reprobate. Everything that follows, creation, the fall, even the redemption through Christ, are simply the means to achieve that number one goal. From this point of view, the fall isn't a surprise. It's a necessary part of the plan to glorify God.
Okay, so what about the other side? That's infralapsarianism. Infra means below. This view flips the script. It says God's decree of election comes logically below or after the decree to create humanity and allow the fall. So back to our architect. This time he designs and builds the city first. Then he foresees that a huge disaster is going to hit. And only then does he make a plan to rescue a select group of people from the ruins.
And you can see that different logic play out right here. First comes the decree to create, then to permit the fall. It's only after considering humanity as this created, fallen group that God, in his mercy, decides to save some and justly pass over others. Here, election isn't the starting point, it's God's loving response to the tragedy of the fall. Putting them side by side like this makes the difference crystal clear. Supralapsarianism puts all the emphasis on God's absolute sovereignty, his freedom to do as he pleases. Infralapsarianism tends to highlight God's mercy and justice. And who are they choosing from? For the supras, God is choosing from individuals who are just possible, people who could be created and could fall. For the infras, he's choosing from a mass of people he already views as created and fallen. It's a subtle but huge difference.
Okay, Section 4. Now, while supra and infra were the main event, they weren't the only players on the field. It's time to widen the lens a bit, because there were other important ideas on the table.
This table kind of gives you the bird's eye view. Other systems popped up, like Arminianism, which argued that God's election is actually based on his foreknowledge, on him knowing in advance who would choose to have faith. As you can see, every little change in the logical order had massive implications for how you understand God's character and his whole plan.
And that brings us to Section 5, the debate's evolution. Let's bring it all back home to where we started, Theodore Beza. Now that we have a handle on the debate, what's the final verdict? And what's the legacy of all this?
Well, the verdict from modern scholarship is not guilty. The whole idea that Beza was this villain who single-handedly corrupted Calvin's theology is now seen as way too simplistic. They call it an antiquated approach. Beza was a major player, for sure, but he wasn't some lone wolf changing everything on his own.
And this timeline really shows you why that verdict holds up. So you have Beza, Calvin's guy, arguing for supralapsarianism. But that view didn't just stay on top forever. After a massive church council called the Synod of Dort really hammered out the terms, the theological tide actually started to shift. Later on, even in Geneva, a hugely important theologian named Francis Turretin was championing the infralapsarian view.
And in the end, it was the infralapsarian view that became the consensus position, the mainstream view in Reformed theology. For many, it just seemed to do a better job of holding God's total sovereignty and his perfect justice in balance, while also giving a solid answer to challenges from other views like Arminianism.
Which leaves us with one last really big thought to chew on. After all this intellectual heavy lifting, you have to wonder, is this whole project, this attempt to map out the logical sequence of God's eternal decrees, is it ultimately just a human attempt to draw a neat little flowchart for the mind of an infinite God? It's a question that reminds us that at the heart of all of this, there's a profound and beautiful mystery.